Welcome back to Advertising is Dead. We talked to Ankit. Hi, Ankit. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Varun. Thanks for having me here.
I want to start off by just to set context for the entire audience. Right? I want to kind of set context in terms of what you guys at Oxfam do, what you've been focusing on, especially in India, so people get a broad basis of what you've actually been pushing towards, and think from there we'll move towards talking about some specifics.
Sure, sounds good. So broadly, Oxfam works on a lot of issues ranging from responding to emergencies to working on issues of gender. But what I and my team specifically focus on is the issues of health and education. And over the past year, we've been running the campaign against rising privatization of education and health called Rights Over Profits. Uh, and sort of the context behind that is, traditionally a lot of civil society organizations, including Oxfam, have focused on strengthening the government system. So a lot of the work has always been with government schools and with the public education system. But given the fact that now almost 50% children actually attend private schools, we felt that this was also an area that needed our attention. Is actually an area that doesn't receive enough attention from civil society organizations. And that's kind of the context within which we said, let's try and work on issues of private schools as well. And yeah, that's kind of a gist of what.
Yeah. What's a when I was looking at what you're focusing on as well, right? And there are, I'm sure there are many contrary points to this, right? And let me pick out a few which I'm pretty sure you hear very often. And people say, okay, one second, public and government schools will not be able to teach the way you need to be taught in today's world. So you need a lot of private education.
Right.
You'll have people turning around and say that there are people who say, do we need to overhaul how education itself functions? People are learning a lot more of apps right now than they learn actually in a classroom, and so on and so forth. So when you're looking at that and you're talking about, kind of re-looking at how privatization functions, what do you feel is the core point we all miss when we say when people say statements like these?
Right. So a couple of things. One is we're very clear that we're not doing a public versus private debate here. We're not arguing for one over the other. What we're essentially saying is, first thing is, most of the best education systems in the world, like Finland, they traditionally have been public education systems. They have large public education systems where all children, regardless of background, attend. So firstly, if one looks at research of successful education systems across the world, it tends to be public in nature. But given that, I think what one is missing here is the issue of, there needs to be accountability of whatever system exists. And we're not saying that it's only the private sector that needs to be accountable. But the fact of the matter is that there has been a lot that's been written about, researched about how government schools need to be better accountable. There's a lot that's been written and a lot of criticism also about how government systems lack accountability. I think what a lot of people are missing is that private schools also need to be held to the same standards of accountability. And that's kind of where we want our focus to be, because essentially right now, if one looks at the given context, private schools are, there isn't enough regulation or isn't enough comprehensive regulation looking at how private schools operate, and also to sort of remedy the issues that private school parents might be facing. So I think that's kind of, I think, the missing point where people get into this dichotomy of public versus private. I guess that's not what we want to focus on. It's more about holding both accountable.
I feel like accountability is an interesting point here, right? And there are multiple tracks here. One track is just genuinely how everyone has started to learn, and in almost a non-linear format of how we are learning has really changed how, let's say, really. So I have a 4-year-old, so I've kind of seen how she learns, and how that would be different from how I would have learned when I was younger. And it's very apparent that we have now generations coming up who are getting so much more information and what they can learn from, and how much they can kind of do with that. And but on the other end of the spectrum, we're also talking about age-old systems that haven't really changed, be it regulations or be it how education functions. And in that, at some point, and I know it's a long-winded question here, but when you look at the private school system, and I feel that it's also a broad thing to call it a private school. I think there's so many different categorizations there, etc. How do you think that, especially the way private schools are functioning, are in many ways, taking away? And you said you spoke about the experience of parents right now, especially at private schools. Which are the parts that we sometimes miss, just in terms of how they function from an accountability standpoint? Because in essence, they are being accountable for the curriculum of some sort, but are they accountable for other factors? What would those factors be? And especially like looking at the modern sense of things, and why we don't really understand enough over there.
Sure. So, one basic way in which government schools, and I mean elementary government schools and private schools differ, is that obviously private schools charge fees. And there are some states which have mechanisms for parents to be actually consulted before fees are set. But the fact of the matter is, one, most states don't really have a law or policy in place which would involve parents in the process of fee fixation. And I guess that's fundamentally, I mean, one level of accountability where parents should be involved, considering that they're the main stakeholders, parents and children. Obviously, schools do have the autonomy to fix fees, but that there has to be a certain process that needs to be followed. And obviously, if they're planning to, hike their fees substantially, the school should be held accountable in terms of at least making a presentation or a case to parents of, okay, this is why we want to increase the fees. These are the three things that we are planning to do. This is how much it will cost, and therefore we're proposing that we increase the fees by X percentage. But the reality is that it's much more arbitrary than that, and parents really have no voice in the matter. And we've seen this during the pandemic as well, with private schools sort of hiking their fees, charging bus fees, transport fees, despite schools being closed, and parents kind of just being, in a sense, consumers who have no voice instead of being active participants of the education process, which they should be rightfully.
Yeah, you make an interesting point about schools during the pandemic, right? Is that, and obviously, I'm coming from a much more privileged point of view, primarily because my daughter does go to a private school, and she has access to a lot more things than most people would. But the simple fact that the conversation still has been, okay, you're paying school fees, but in a sense, you are actually the parents doing a lot of half the teacher's job as well. And on top of that, the fees are going to be there, and on top of that, there's other things you have to do, like how you're having to balance work and school as well, and everything else around that. And the core point of what is right to charge and what is not right to charge during this period. You mentioned the buses. I think that makes total sense. Why would you charge for it? And I think the rebuttal many times is, no, but you still need these resources. We won't be able to sustain or keep them in this sense. So we'll go into a loss. And at the end of the day, it's something we have to pay for. So how does, and maybe there's an international example for this, and I'm sure you would know. So what have been models that have worked, especially to really boost up and public education in a way that, again, I'm not going one or the other. I'm just saying that from an overall regulatory standpoint, what have been regulations that have worked, let's say globally, that in many cases we could kind of adopt and kind of take on?
Sure. So I'll sort of answer. There are two questions, I guess, as part of what you're asking. One is the argument of schools about what they can charge and what might be some solutions to that. And the other is the broader question of strengthening public education. I'll take the private one first and then get into the broader question. The argument that a lot of private schools have made during the pandemic and even before that is that we're charging fees because we need to pay our teachers, we need to maintain the infrastructure of the school, and we have a bunch of these recurring expenses that we need to sort of pay for. In Delhi has done a lot of interesting work with regard to doing audits of private school accounts. And what they found is they'd just done an audit of about 10 to 15 schools, and they actually found that they had a surplus of about 50 crores on their accounts. But so while the private schools were claiming that we don't have any money to pay our teachers, which is why we need to hike fees and ask parents to pay more, the accounts kind of found something different. And I'm not saying this is something that's true for all schools. Obviously, there are a lot of small schools that have suffered during the pandemic and are genuinely facing difficulties and even managing to pay their teachers and run their school. But I think a simple solution to this is just ensuring that the school's books of accounts are available in the public uh,
Mm.
domain. And this is something that's already mandated under law in the Punjab fee regulation. Even the Chandigarh fee regulation actually asks for this to be done. So it's essentially what one is saying is transparency. We are not arguing for, saying that, schools should cap their fees at a certain level or not charge anything. I think it's just be transparent, be open, uh, and after that, I think it's charge what is reasonable. So that's
Yeah.
from a transparency standpoint.
I just have a question on this one
Sure.
before you go to the other one, Shravansh, is
Yeah.
that a lot of schools might turn around, and again, in many ways, what I'm trying to do is what would the counter points be, right, to what
Sure.
you're saying,
Sure.
and what someone would turn around and say, one thing, we're still a business. In many ways, we still have to run. We have to be profitable, so we invest for the future, etc. And I'm sure those are words that get thrown around and in an audit. But as private institutions, for them to put out in a transparent form, um, some of them might say once again that, but we're still supposed to make money out of this, and that might obviously might not want to show it as much as they will have to if they're transparent. So is there a line where it becomes okay, you need to be fully transparent but you can't make too much money, or you need to be transparent but obviously you are a private entity, you will make money, but be reasonable about it. So how do you draw that line between both? Because I think once, if you can actually get to that line, then a lot more people will push towards actually getting it done. I think that because it seems like you're not
Right.
you're not being told to make money, then someone will say, okay, 1 second, doesn't make sense. So how do you draw that line?
Sure. So, I mean, there's actually a famous Supreme Court judgment involving PA5, which said that fundamentally education is not for profit,
Hmm.
but it allowed schools to make a reasonable surplus. Uh, Now, again, of course, the challenge is what this reasonable surplus
Yeah,
should be.
quantifying reasonable is a tricky one. Yeah.
Is, I guess, kind of where we're stuck. I guess that's the area of contention. But uh, it's clear in our legal framework that schools can't profiteer, as in
Hmm.
it does not allow for profiteering for sure. So
Yeah.
it allows for some reasonable surplus to allow schools to be functional in order
Yeah.
to, let's say, expand their infrastructure. Uh, let's say, set up more classrooms, for example, and basically be like a functional entity, but
Hmm.
not at the cost of actually making supernormal
Yeah.
profits like a regular business would.
Yeah, and also at that point, and also don't go towards systems like there obviously have been many instances of, especially in the pandemic, of even this online education cutting off online access to classes because you haven't paid fees or you haven't paid the extra part and stuff like that, which kind of goes against what you just said, which in a sense is that, and I agree with you, the education in many forms should almost be like a basic right for everybody to have, and I guess even that would kind of go against what the norm around education is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we had done a quick survey of this with private school parents in Delhi. And they were, of course, because of a lot of challenges, parents were struggling to pay fees. And of those who were unable to pay fees, almost 60% reported that their child's access to education was blocked, which sort of goes against, obviously, their fundamental right to education. There were also guidelines by the National Commission for Protection of Child Rights, which said clearly that, this is a difficult time. Kids obviously themselves are going through mental health issues. And for schools to do something like this at that point in time is not very sensitive.
Yeah. I want to come to the second part of the earlier question I'd asked you, kind of talking about how uh, what we could kind of borrow as models which have really worked globally to kind of bring this to some form of like balance.
Sure. So again, there isn't one thing, but I guess there are two or three broad principles of what one can do to strengthen the government school system. And if one looks at the Indian context, it isn't like we don't have good government schools. If one looks at Kendra Vidyalayas, they're obviously not even at par. In many ways, they're better than a lot of private schools out there. And what this kind of comes down to is fundamentally a difference in funding. So while a Kendriya Vidyalaya, the per child expenditure in a Kendriya Vidyalaya is more than 6 or 7 times that of a regular government school. That's fundamentally where we need to be focusing. Uh, in around more than 50 years ago, the Kothari Commission, which was sort of set up to suggest how to strengthen the public education system, said that we need to have 6% of the GDP sort of earmarked for strengthening public education system. And sort of even 50 years later, it's been the same ask that most civil society organizations, academicians have been asking for, and we're still at somewhere around 3.2%. So first thing is we're spending about half of what we should be. Uh, and what that is doing again is we don't have enough teachers in our classrooms. We don't have good enough infrastructure because we don't have enough money to be able to do that. So the first is, of course, fundamentally the funding to strengthen these systems. The second thing, though, that systems like Finland have done quite well is they've managed a good mix of uh, accountability and trust at the same time. So what I mean by that is in the Indian context, uh, because there's a belief that people won't work unless they're monitored, we sort of stretch towards the other extreme of saying, we'll monitor teachers' attendance, we'll keep taking tests, we'll make sure that there's like a punch out sort of system to ensure that they're coming. Uh, Instead of let's say a country like Finland, what they would do is make sure that the best people become teachers in the system. So you trust the people who are entering the system. You're getting the best people who are already well trained. So there's no doubt about their caliber. And they're kind of trusting them and supporting them to do their job well, sort of giving them autonomy to do what they do best. And I guess that's something that we also need to do is to be able to trust our teachers a little bit more, give them more autonomy in the classroom, at the same time support them uh, to actually get better and get better people into the system.
It's an interesting point to talk about supporting teachers, right? And I feel that at some point in this entire piece, that's the one piece of the, I mean, it's the most core part of education, and I feel that oftentimes there's so much that happens around it that we don't focus on the teachers enough, and especially when I'm just going to like just how the experience of education is kind of evolved for a lot of them, and so in that case, how do you also kind of look at teachers and saying, because on the other end of the spectrum, and as I have meandered through this question, teachers are also asking to be paid more, rather paid better rather than more, right? You have a lot of, there's a certain lack of quality teachers across the board. I know there's some of them which are there in primary schools, private schools, etc. But across the board, there's also that. So if you have a private school today saying, okay, no, I have to get the best quality teachers in, so I have to pay this kind of premium. How do you make sure that you are also balancing that part out in terms of like, how can the government look at it by saying, okay, we need to make sure that it is something that is, you can live a good life by being a teacher, which in many cases isn't true right now. So how do you kind of build that into a regulation?
So interestingly, this is an area which kind of might be surprising for a lot of the listeners on the podcast, is that the Indian government, the government school teachers in India actually get paid better relatively to, if sort of one compares Indian government teachers with, let's say, the average pay in India, uh, they actually don't do too badly compared to, let's say, a country like the US, where the teachers actually sort of rank in the bottom quartile of payment, and they actually get paid below the median pay in the country. So in India, honestly, government school teachers, it's not strictly an issue of pay, and pay has actually gotten better with the sixth pay commission and the seventh pay commission coming in. Uh, Obviously, there are variations between states, uh, but obviously, with states like Delhi, Karnataka, Maharashtra, teachers are actually paid quite well in government schools, and in fact, the opposite is true in most private schools, where teachers are paid quite badly. In fact, for a lot of private schools, teachers are paid less than even 10,000 rupees a month. And I would actually say that it's the rights of private school teachers that need to be protected, because the government has told private schools as well that you need to pay teachers according to the norms in the sixth and seventh pay commission.
Yeah.
But a lot of schools are not doing that. So it's barring a few elite private schools, which obviously charge a lot of money. A lot of private school teachers are in fact not paid that well. So the, in that sense, the regulation of private schools also needs to have sort of clauses about how do we protect the rights of teachers in terms of
Yeah.
making sure they have good working conditions, they have uh, adequate pay, they have the same rights in terms of be it social protection, insurance, and stuff like that.
That is surprising though. And and I guess also has to do a lot with just perception, right? You perceive, I guess, public schools a certain way, or government schools a certain way, and you perceive private schools a certain way. I have a bunch more questions, but I know we need to go in for a break. So we're going to do that and be right back with Advertising is Dead. Welcome back to Advertising is Dead. We're still talking to Ankit. Um, Ankit, before we went into break, we obviously spoke about teachers, but I want to take this broader now. I want to say that one part is what do you implement, and then comes in the part of how do you implement, and especially with a country like ours, which is so complex and so large and has so
Right.
many different pieces happening. How could the government kind of go about implementing a way, implementing this into it, or is the solution to kind of rethink how this even functions? Because now with the digital education being such a strong focus, in terms of how the last 2 years have gone, and I know that still required someone to have a device and etc. What if someone doesn't have one, and so on and so forth? But does the solution lie elsewhere to help bring some sort of balance into this, or and what would your points be on that?
Sure. So, with regard to, if one looks at the current regulation system, the national education policy which came out last year, uh, the policy also acknowledges that the current regulation system has, in that sense, not worked, and we do need a rethink of how that can work more effectively. Uh, since you talked about issues of implementation, uh, I think my sort of opinion on this is for the government to actually make it easier for themselves and also to make it more effective. I think we need to decentralize the system in many ways.
Hmm.
Uh, and what I mean by that is having a lot of decisions taken at the school level itself rather than everything being done by the government regulatory system.
Hmm.
Having a mechanism in the place where the parents and teachers and the school management works together to sort out most issues at the school level itself. And that would mean simple things like having a committee at the school level, which consists of parents, teachers, and the school management. And any major decision that has to be taken sort of goes through that committee, and obviously
Hmm.
making sure that parent representation remains high on that committee. So a lot of the issues that we saw during the pandemic, there was a lot of litigation that we saw as well, where
Hmm.
we had
Hmm.
parent associations filing cases in high courts versus private schools countering. A lot of this could have been avoided if, at the school level itself, there was a mechanism where parents, teachers, and schools kind of sort out uh, the issue and agree on what needs to be done. If this doesn't work, then of course one can have a mechanism at the district level, uh, which parents and schools both could approach. But fundamentally, I think we do need a mechanism to sort of decentralize this, uh, so that it's not just the government doing it, but in some sense, uh, the parents also playing a role in that regulation.
So, looking at the effort you're kind of putting into to pushing towards regulation, if I'm someone listening to this podcast right now, what can I do to kind of help? Because um, I do believe a large number of people today, and I feel especially today's generation, and I said today, I'm generalizing across millennial, Gen Z, and I'm an almost 40-year-old millennial, so I think we're old enough now as a generation. Um, and what can we kind of do to kind of help? Because I think most of us do believe that you need to have more balance in how education functions. Private, public as well. Across the board, there needs to be a certain level of thing there. So what can one do to kind of help you guys in what you're doing?
Sure. So, couple of things, three things, I guess, specifically that one could help with. One is we have a petition to the education minister on our website, and I guess we'll share the link later to that. And essentially, that petition is calling the education minister to have a national level comprehensive regulatory framework, which includes aspects of not just fee regulation, but also broader aspects of making sure children are not discriminated against, and so on. And we're essentially calling for that to make sure that there is a comprehensive framework that then other states could adopt. So that's one, is sort of signing that petition and sharing that. The other thing is we also have an online survey right now that we are doing to capture the experiences of private school parents. Uh, and the idea is to actually get evidence on what we're talking about from parents themselves. So a lot of the issues that I spoke about on this podcast, we're trying to uh, get evidence of that from private school parents and then use that evidence to approach the government for greater regulation. So the second thing would be, I guess, fill the survey if you are a private school parent. And if you're not, just, I guess, circulate that in your network so that we have evidence that can help. Uh, and the third thing, I guess, is if again, this would be more applicable to private school parents, but uh, one is get a sense of, what is the regulation, what are your rights as parents. So for example, if you're in Maharashtra, the rights of parents is that they should be consulted by the school before the fee is high. So I guess doing some homework, and we'll as Oxfam, we're trying to sort of have these state-wise fact sheets so that parents can go through that, but I guess also just being aware of your rights as parents, because that is again sort of the job half done. If parents themselves know that this is what my right is, then they can hold the school accountable rather than waiting for the government to step in.
Awesome. So I'm actually going to go towards the what I do at the end of every episode. I throw a bunch of questions at my guests, which have nothing to do with what we've spoken about right now. So I'm going to do that to you as well. And considering what you do in, if I can call it your day job, what do you do when you're not focusing on work? Are there interests beyond that you have? What do you spend a lot of time doing? People, one second, on your day job you do this, but this is what you enjoy doing otherwise. So what would that be?
So I love sports. I love playing football. I just played badminton today morning.
Yeah.
And yeah, I spend a lot of my time, I guess, even uh, on call sometimes looking at places I can travel to. So,
Nice.
and particularly hike to or trek to.
Yeah.
So it's kind of what I enjoy doing.
I've always wanted to ask someone who enjoys hiking and trekking. While and I'll sound like a really lazy person. It's amazing when you're right on top. What do you enjoy about the actual climbing part of it? Is the question I always ask this question because I want to figure out if I can find that level of push.
I guess it's the scenery around you, right? So it's not just for me. It's not just about as cliched as this sounds. It's not just about, I guess, the destination. But in many ways, yeah, I just enjoy the trail and sort of leaving all my devices behind and just being with nature. I guess that's the part that I enjoy most. So just kind of walking without any agenda.
It's actually that sounds lovely. I think that walking without an agenda is something we should all do more often. Anything that you've read, listened to, or watched recently that you'd recommend?
Hmm. I've been getting a little lazy with the reading, but
Mm,
I'm reading A Suitable Boy, which is like
mm,
I'm super late in doing so. I watched the series first, and now I'm reading the book. But
yeah,
I think it's a really beautifully written book in terms of a lot of these, Booker Prize sort of authors tend to use
yeah.
very difficult uh, English, and their phrases are sort of quite convoluted. I think this is if you want to learn how to write, I think it's a beautiful book in terms of how to construct simple, clear sentences. So,
Um, so I actually want to tweak my last question for a change. So I normally ask my guests that I do a spin off the name of the show. The name of the show is Advertising is Dead, but we talk about most things around now. And I try to think of, okay, what will not die as a question. But to you, I'm actually going to flip it around and saying that why do you feel that pushing towards a more balanced and regulated form of education will honestly make education more alive than it is right now? I'm flipping this around for you.
sure. So I guess it's essentially we want a system where children of all backgrounds interact with each other. Right? I mean, if I just look at my childhood, and maybe even your case might have been similar, when we went to school, we had kids from fairly different backgrounds in the
Yeah,
same classroom. We had someone whose father was an auto rickshaw driver. We had someone who owned a massive car showroom. We had
yeah,
someone whose mother worked as a cook in the school. And so as children, we were all aware that, there is this diversity of classes, and maybe there is evidence to suggest this, and I would also like to believe it, that this in some sense maybe made us a little bit more empathetic about
mm,
different classes existing and about the inequality that exists.
yeah,
Uh, but I think now the challenge is we've reached a stage where children might go through their whole life and their whole schooling system without ever interacting with anyone who isn't exactly like them. And I guess that's where we need to make education more alive, because
yeah,
education is not just about the curriculum; it's also about the diversity of lived experiences. So if I am in a classroom just with children who speak like me, look like me, think like me, are dressed like me, then I'm really not learning anything different. I mean, we're just all clones of
mm,
each other, as
yeah,
opposed to if I'm in a classroom where I'm with a completely different set of people, and I know that it's my world is not the only world
mm,
out there. And I think
yeah.
that's kind of what uh, at least I would like to push towards, where we have a world that kind of coexist and learn from each other.
And I think that's perfectly put. And honestly, is one of the pieces that I feel is really missing, that we all built our own bubbles in every single
Mm.
space for ourselves. And at some point,
Yeah,
you need to be part of each other's um, bubbles, if considering I'm
yeah.
just using that analogy and taking it further. Thanks a lot, Ankit, for coming on the show. I think it's there's a lot to learn from what you guys are doing, and just from what you've given as information, some of the pieces would be something a lot of us wouldn't really know about. And for everyone listening in, you know how you can kind of from the petition to the survey, we're going to drop it in the show notes. So make sure you kind of put that in there. And Ankit, thank you for coming on Advertising Instead.
Thanks a lot, Varun. I had a good time.
IVM